Early in the morning of November 21st, 1916, a powerful explosion shook the hospital ship Britannic. The First World War was underway. Britannic was sailing through the Aegean Sea when she struck a German naval mine. There were more than 1,000 people on board. The ship began to sink rapidly, and in just 55 minutes the disaster was over. Luckily, most of those on board managed to escape with their lives. Among the survivors was 29-year-old stewardess and volunteer nurse Violet Jessop. The Britannic had been designed and equipped to face potential disasters, the largest of the 3 legendary Olympic-class liners. One of her sister ships was the famously ill-fated Titanic. Engineers had carefully applied the lessons learned from that earlier tragedy. The hull was reinforced with a double bottom, and the watertight bulkheads were improved so the ship could remain afloat longer. She carried 48 lifeboats, enough places for everyone, unlike the Titanic. But the mine strike produced such a violent explosion that the Britannic immediately began to pitch forward and sink by the bow. In addition, because this was a hospital ship, the crew regularly aired out the wards, leaving many portholes open. Seawater rushed in through these openings and flooded the lower decks at high speed. The evacuation of passengers and crew went much more smoothly than on the Titanic 4 years earlier. The disaster happened in broad daylight rather than at night. The water of the Aegean was warm enough for people to survive for some time. The vessel itself was structurally safer, there were more lifeboats, and the crew carried out the evacuation in an orderly manner. However, a new danger arose. The ship's engines were still running as she went down, and the enormous propellers were spinning furiously beneath the surface. Violet took a place in one of the lifeboats. To the horror of everyone watching, 2 other boats that had already been launched were sucked straight toward the blades of the propellers and were instantly smashed to pieces, killing many of the occupants. Realizing that her own boat was about to meet the same fate, Violet jumped into the sea at the last possible moment. The powerful suction current pulled her toward the sinking liner. She struck her head against the ship's keel, but she managed to resurface and was rescued by another lifeboat. This was already a remarkable escape. But what made it even more astonishing was the fact that this was Violet Jessop's 3rd time aboard a sinking Olympic-class ship. In 1911, the young Violet Jessop began working as a stewardess on board the Olympic, the first of 3 massive and luxurious transatlantic liners built by the White Star Line. The second ship in this series would be the Titanic, and the third, the Britannic. On September 20th, 1911, under the command of Captain Edward Smith, who would later lead the Titanic on its fatal maiden voyage, the Olympic departed from Southampton. She steamed along the coast of the Isle of Wight, heading into the busy shipping lanes. At 11:58 in the morning, as the Olympic and a Royal Navy cruiser approached a narrow stretch of water, the 2 vessels were moving on parallel courses. Suddenly, the Olympic, while turning to starboard, crossed the path of the smaller cruiser. The liner's vast hull created a powerful suction wave that destabilized the cruiser, causing her to lose steering control. The cruiser's bow had been specially reinforced with a projecting ram designed for ramming enemy ships. This ram struck the Olympic's starboard side, gouging 2 large gaping holes in her hull. Despite the collision, the liner remained afloat. The crew swiftly closed the watertight doors, isolating the flooded compartments. There were no fatalities and no serious injuries. Panic did not break out on board. The cruiser, however, was severely damaged, and White Star Line, the company that owned the Olympic, was forced to pay the Royal Navy a substantial sum in compensation. Paradoxically, the accident actually improved the reputation of the new liners. The Olympic had survived a serious collision and returned to port under her own power. The public became even more convinced that White Star Line's ships were truly unsinkable. Nevertheless, Violet was uneasy after the crash. She felt some hesitation about joining the crew of the Titanic when the company began recruiting for the maiden voyage of its grand new flagship. But in the end, she agreed to sail. The Titanic was a symbol of human technological triumph, of unstoppable progress, of sheer luxury and confidence. She was gigantic and powerful, fitted with 20 lifeboats, built with a double bottom, and divided by watertight bulkheads. Her design promised that even if 4 of her 20 compartments flooded, the ship would remain stable. On paper, everything looked perfect. In practice, as we now know, the number of lifeboats was insufficient. They could accommodate only 1,178 people, while on board there were 1,317 passengers and 908 crew members. Maritime safety regulations simply hadn't caught up with the rapidly growing size of ships like the Olympic and the Titanic. On April 10, 1912, the Titanic set off on her first and last voyage from Southampton to New York. The vessel offered unprecedented luxury for travelers in first and second class. There was a swimming pool, a squash court, both open and enclosed promenades, and lavish cabins decorated with gold leaf, silk, and mahogany furniture. Conditions in third class, where hundreds of poorer emigrants were traveling, were naturally much simpler. But most of these passengers were overjoyed simply to have a ticket because they were leaving Europe behind and heading to America to begin a new life. Late on the night of April 14th, Violet read her prayers and prepared to go to sleep. Suddenly, she felt a strange vibration, followed by a low, tearing sound. The Titanic had struck an iceberg, which ripped open the starboard side of the hull. 5 compartments were breached, one more than the ship could withstand while remaining afloat. Slowly and inexorably, one of history's greatest maritime disasters began to unfold. People on board reacted in dramatically different ways. Some panicked, wept, and prayed. Others remained calm and dignified to the very end. Some tried to force their way to the lifeboats, while others accepted their fate in silence. The crew did their duty under worsening conditions, organizing the evacuation as best they could. The ship's orchestra famously continued playing as the vessel settled lower and lower into the Atlantic. Officers directed the loading of lifeboats according to the rule, women and children first. In theory, this was correct, but in the confusion it led to many boats leaving partially empty, even as desperate crowds gathered elsewhere on the vast ship searching for safety. The group of stewardesses to which Violet belonged would later be praised as an example of calm, disciplined behavior. They assisted third-class female passengers, many of whom spoke no English, helping them to board the lifeboats. First Officer Charles Lightoller, who played a crucial role in rescuing passengers, ordered part of the crew and several stewardesses to board the lifeboats as well, to set an example and to help with rowing once the boats were in the water. Violet received a direct order to take a place in lifeboat number 16. There were about 40 people in the boat, mostly women and children, along with a few sailors and stewardesses. As they prepared to lower the lifeboat, an officer handed Violet a bundle, a baby that had been left on the deck during the chaos. She wrapped the infant in her blanket to shield it from the icy wind. She herself was wearing a cork life jacket. The boat was lowered down into the dark, freezing Atlantic. Violet later recalled how she watched the sinking ship in a sort of trance, as if by sheer willpower I could hold her on the surface. The lights were still burning. The band on the upper deck played the hymn, "Nearer, my God, to Thee." The sailors at the oars rowed away, and the people in the lifeboat watched in horror as the enormous, supposedly unsinkable liner slowly disappeared beneath the black water. 2 hours and 40 minutes after the collision, at 2:20 a.m., the Titanic's stern lifted almost vertically into the air, and then the entire ship slipped beneath the waves. That terrible night, 1,517 passengers and crew died. Many of them were wearing life jackets and remained afloat, but froze to death in the icy Atlantic. Lifeboat number 16 was rescued 8 hours later by the Carpathia, the ship that had come to help. As Violet stepped onto the rescue ship's deck, a woman rushed up to her in tears, snatched the baby from her arms, and disappeared into the crowd. Violet never learned the names of either the woman or the child. Later records suggested that the only infant in boat number 16 was 5-month-old Assad Thomas, who had been handed to another survivor, Edwina Trout. It remains unclear who exactly the baby was, whom Violet had protected that night. Many years later, Violet received a late-night phone call. A man's voice said that he was the baby she had saved, then abruptly hung up. She hoped the story was true, but the caller never contacted her again. After the disaster, Violet returned to her family in England and slowly began to recover. She later said, "Above all, I missed my toothbrush." Naturally, When she abandoned ship, she hadn't taken any personal belongings with her, that humble object became a symbol for her. From then on, she always made sure to keep her toothbrush safe at sea. When the First World War began in 1914, Violet joined the British Red Cross as a nurse. At first she worked with wounded soldiers on land, but later she received an assignment aboard the hospital ship Britannic. She explained her decision to return to sea very plainly. "I needed work and money. Sailing was the only trade I knew." She had to support her mother and brothers, but it wasn't just financial necessity. She also wrote that she wanted to go back to sea quickly before fear could take hold. In 1920, Violet once again climbed the gangway of the Olympic, the very liner on which she had experienced her first maritime disaster. She continued working on ships for 3 more decades. Over the course of her career, she circumnavigated the globe twice and visited dozens of countries. Newspapers gave her a nickname, Miss Unsinkable. It wasn't exactly a hilarious joke, considering that the same nickname had once been applied to the Titanic. Her colleagues noted that Violet Jessop always took safety very seriously. She personally inspected each cabin to ensure that life jackets were available in the correct sizes. She also checked that safety instructions were posted on the walls in multiple languages. In 1950, at the age of 63, Violet retired from seafaring. She settled in a small house in the English countryside, where she spent her days gardening and raising chickens. She lived a long life and died peacefully in 1971 at the age of 83 from heart failure. Despite her very real adventures, Violet's life became surrounded by myths and legends over time. One popular story claimed that the young officer who had ordered her into the lifeboat on the Titanic was her secret lover. This is false. Another legend said that she was the only person to survive multiple disasters involving Olympic-class liners. That, too, is untrue. Stoker, Arthur John Priest, served on the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic, surviving all 3 incidents. In fact, he was also aboard 2 additional ships that sank later. By his own account, shipping companies were sometimes reluctant to hire him, fearing he brought bad luck. Lookout Archie Jewell was one of the watchmen on the Titanic, and later survived the sinking of the Britannic. His luck ran out during the First World War, when a German submarine torpedoed the Donegal, the ship he was serving on. He died in that attack. First Officer Charles Lightoller also survived the sinking of the Titanic. Thrown into the freezing water, he narrowly avoided being sucked under by the vortex as the ship went down. He found an overturned collapsible lifeboat, clung to it, helped several other survivors climb aboard, kept everyone together through the night, and signaled to other lifeboats so they could be rescued. Lightoller would later survive the loss of another ship during the First World War. Then, during the Second World War, by then retired, he took his personal yacht to Dunkirk to help evacuate trapped British soldiers. For both Violet Jessop and Charles Lightoller, survival was not merely a matter of luck. They remained calm, followed procedures, and made split-second decisions in moments of extreme danger. When Lightoller was pulled beneath the sinking Titanic, when Violet's lifeboat was drawn toward the spinning propellers of the Britannic. Their stories remain powerful examples of resilience, discipline, and courage in the face of overwhelming disasters, shipwreck, war, and the forces of nature itself.